Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Your host, Aaron Mayer, and our guest today is my brother from the struggle, as they say, in many movements, but he's the California Donor Table Director, California Donor Table Fund Director, my brother, Ludovic Blain. I will also have to confess for full disclosure, because you know that you're in a righteous movement when you got family members from different fronts of the struggle. So he's also a family member. We come from a family of fierce activists, civil rights leaders, and fighters. And, the apple just comes from that one root in that tree. And my brother, cousin, Ludovic Blain, again, welcome. And brothers, I'm very happy to have you, because we've been running a series on pioneers, African-American, people of color pioneers within the environmental justice movement, the environmental movement, but that movement that is shaping and changing the broader environmental movement, getting it to where it should be, reflective of all humanity. Because if they're going to pledge to save humanity, enlist humanity, it must include all people. And this is something that we've been always fighting for since day one. So I want to say welcome and give you a hearty welcome to the show, my brother.
Thank you. So glad to be here. Thanks for having me on, cuz. Wow, yeah, imagining being a veteran in the movement, but I did start decades ago, so I guess that's true. But I haven't aged a bit. And if you do movement work, it's pretty much guaranteed you don't age. So or maybe it's the reverse. But anyway.
Well, I was going to put a younger picture of you, because when we do the promo and we promote this on YouTube, I was going to put that picture of you when you're about in your 20s. I said,
yeah,
I can't do that to him. Oh, man. So, brother, tell us a little bit about the California Donor Table and how you ended up in that powerful organizer. Because this, like I said, we always talk about the passion within a movement, the passion within struggles. But one of the things that we found out early on in the environmental movement, the environmental justice movement, the civil rights movement, is that the biggest Achilles heel in most poor people's movements and people of color movements is the finance, access to the revenue to allow us to, as they say, speak at all levels of power with full voice and with full agency. And you can only go as far agency-wise, outreach-wise, as you got the money and the means to support us. And then there's the other hook and trap: whoever pays the piper calls the tune. And that's that other trap of some people, they'll give you money, but you got to really move your message through what they want. So tell us a little bit about your journey to the donor table, and why did you find, as I say, and grow in that space? And I found an article from 2007, Do Right Man. So was that when you made the big jump, or was it earlier?
It was a little bit after. So I've been at the California Donor Table for about 13 years, since 2009. I was the first full-time staffer hired. There's donor tables in several dozen states. This one was started by a set of individual donors who already, when they were starting it, had a track record of commitment to racial equity, to building power in progressive communities of color around the state, and who wanted to, who had already been kind of doing it individually and then trying to do it together, and realized that they needed a full-time staffer to help staff their collaborative efforts on that.
Mm-hmm.
I came to this work because I wanted to do donor alignment work, because, as you said, one of the biggest challenges is the lack of money to do this work, or at least the way that applying and attracting money
Mm-hmm.
Not only doesn't build movement, it actually builds siloization and competition and chasing shiny objects and things like that. So throughout my career, including in the environmental justice movement, I found myself so many times not just doing the work necessary to pursue justice and build power for communities who were most impacted, including my own, but having to deal with the bad, dumb, nepotistic, racist, or just plain old stupid investments that folks with money, whether it was individual donors or foundations, had made, that would distort the field. And the rest of us had to not only deal with the Chevron of the world, but also then this new project that was a bad idea from the beginning.
Right.
So when I found out about the donor table, I was really excited about the explicit commitment by the donors to talk about aligning themselves one, and then two, decentering themselves and aligning them as a group with the groups from the most impacted communities.
Mm-hmm.
And the third part that was real exciting was most of the time there's nonpartisan 501c3 money for our work to hold politicians and corporations accountable. But then usually it's mostly white folks that get political money. So
Right.
what actually happens is that
But let me pause you right there. It's not on the political money, which is a C4, but in many cases, when the first big money comes in, they hire a white executive director.
right,
So
white executive,
when it is, I call the magic line is $65,000 and above. The organization, while the bottom worker bees will be people of color, what I call the front, but the executive leadership is not necessarily an authentic impacted voice, and usually a white executive director, since most not-for-profit spaces are dominated by females, but basically a white female executive director, again, whose heart may be in the right place. But it reminds me of that scene in The Color Purple on Thanksgiving Day when Oprah had to go home, and the sister who cared and had empathy about Oprah, her big moment was just to drive the car, but she only had one problem: she couldn't put it in reverse. She couldn't turn it around. And so when the people go to help her, she carrying out on them, and don't touch me now. Then I give this all to you people. And so the power of things lost in translation, and I've seen this early on in the EJ movement and the EJ struggle, and part of my struggles with the Sierra Club to this day, is it's not too often that they don't let you know or show that this is still white people's money.
Right. Entirely so. So then over time, they promised, and over time they delivered, that money would go almost exclusively to progressive communities of color. Progressive, because not all people of color are progressive. And
that's true. I tell people we're the standard distribution. We're like, we got the continuum distribution.
Right, we got
everything from the radical left to Clarence Thomas Wright. So we got the full. We're like color. America.
And that we would center the groups, and including giving them political money. So even though people think of California as a solidly blue state, and at the state level it is, there's 40 million people in California. We have actually the most number of Trump voters of any state in the country.
True.
And we have robust parts of the state that are solidly red and other places that are purple. And so we've moved robust amounts of political money to progressive folks of color to make sure that not only were they able to 501c3 hold whoever was elected accountable. That's actually not the best way to do it. The best way is to actually use political money to elect people who are either accountable to you or are you. Actually, they're not accountable to you. They are from you.
Right.
And then they default, try to do great stuff. And then you can.
But people don't realize that California, Texas, and Florida demographically are alike.
Correct.
And it shows you that if progressives are not really pushing out to shape equity at the table, all it takes, as we already know, like South Africa, a factional minority of right wingers to then dominate through gerrymandering and other processes, and then have a minority ruling a majority.
Right.
And so folks don't realize that, it's not that one state's liberal. It's just that California and New York to some degree, and Massachusetts to some degree, has actually, at least there's been, more of an engagement of progressive forces. They've survived the intense gerrymandering of power and the concentration of power in the hands of a few.
Survived so many attacks. And I'd say, I'm 52, and I remember when Texas was the solid.
You're young.
Place. Yeah. I remember when Texas was the solid Democratic place, and I thought California was the apartheid place with all those right-wing, explicitly white supremacist, racist.
Hey, Simi Valley.
And so in the same time frame, Texas, Florida, and California have crossed paths with the same demographics. They've crossed paths. So it's a reminder to know that, yes, we can turn Texas and Florida into better versions of California, but there's nothing to say that the right wing can't turn California back into worse versions of Texas and Florida.
Exactly.
So demographics, it means that there will be some change in destiny, but it doesn't mean better unless folks both fight and people with money fund that fight. And so that's what I've been most impressed by and excited by. That's why I've been on for more than a dozen years. We're all in the fight. We support almost exclusively progressive folks of color, almost the majority women of color, local races on up. And we've helped the environmental justice movement. We've been one of the major funders of environmental justice groups on the C4 and partisan sides to get them to actually electoralize their work. So that's been some of the most exciting work that we've done at CDT.
And to me, what's also powerful is that they've been very fortunate and blessed in that they got a director of integrity, because one of the issues is, a lot of people have been in the field so long, so poor, that they feel that it's going to be the only cup they drink, and they commit unethical acts and they take down a beautiful organization. And the blessing of seeing you in this place and the work that you've been doing for the past decade, and as I say, and really making California rock. And so we need to replicate you in other states like Texas and Florida. But listen, we can't do that until I get this commercial in the pay for this show. So we'll be right back in a moment. Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Your host, Aaron Mayer, and we have with us one of the leaders within the national, international movement, because I'm not going to just let you know that your work is just going nationally. But again, people are emulating the work of the donor table and building power, grassroots power within the state, as they say, and that in this particular case, California. And it's organizations like yours, Ludovic, and your leadership that not only get to promote Jayapals, the Rokanas of the world, and that their voice is good, because in New York, they're still scared of somebody like a Jayapal. They're scared of somebody like a Kana. They're scared of somebody who will actually just talk real. We got what I call chump politics in New York State. Listen, we got one of the oldest Black and Hispanic caucuses in the country.
Yeah.
And some of them, are like, well, it's our turn. What do you mean it's our turn? Because they want to be like the Gambino family, And so some people, again, you hit the point on the head. Just because they're people of color does not make them progressive, does not make their agenda the people's agenda. And it is fighting a multi-level, three-dimensional fight. And a lot of this really comes from the institution of racism within the United States of America. It's about power and how we emulate power in the image of those we worship. And those images are not necessarily healthy images. They have not been healthy for American society because they're toxic, white, male-centered, sexist, homophobic, racist. And, we tend to want to emulate that and say, well, they had it for a while. Let us come in here and do the same. No, we don't need to do the same.
Right. We need to make things better. So one of our main pitches is that we marry both the diversity as the only ideology work, meaning folks in power are too white, too male, too rich, too straight, all those things. And we want to diversify that. So that's one. And then there's other folks who are working to get progressive folks in office, but who don't care about any diversity. So they're okay if every single person they support are older white guys. And what we say, and what we've been doing for the last dozen years, is you can actually do both. Now, when you just say it in words, it doesn't sound that impactful, but there are sets of progressive folks of color and white folks who are willing to work for folks of color, right, on behalf of folks of color.
And you prove that.
Right. And we can actually do that work together. So I know that this is an environmental piece, but I'd say when the group of Latino elected officials and union leaders met in LA and were recorded saying all kind of racist, homophobic stuff around all kind of folks, one of the things that they said was that George Gascon, who was a Cuban immigrant, was with the Blacks. And almost always when non-Black people say that, that's a bad thing. He's with the Blacks. And what I really appreciate, and George Gascon, the district attorney of Los Angeles, is one of the folks that we supported, and he beat a bad Black woman incumbent who was pro-death penalty. Okay, so that's the politics there. He announced, instead of saying, I'm not with the blacks. I'm with everybody. And no, the first thing he said was, I am with the blacks. And so performative stuff is not enough for me. His policies have been great. He's working
Right.
on that stuff. But for him, just a non-black person to be attacked with the supposed slur, you're with the blacks,
Right.
an intra people of color attack.
Right.
And then for him to say, you're damn right, I am actually with the
And
blacks.
this is something, as you know, within our own family, because we are Creole, we're African American, we're Afro Creoles. And so one of the biggest struggles of colonialism, so when the slave boats stopped in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, they engaged in colorism. Colorism is the thing, in this case, the lighter you are, the more that you're called, Caucasian, or you're allowed to call yourself white. And naturally, the U.S. playing on that, the census, Hispanics get to choose whatever they want to be, and they don't get to abide by this, what we call the one drop rule, because as you know, in the U.S., you got one drop African American, you're African American, okay? But you get to say, I'm Dominican, I'm Haitian, or whatever. You hide behind the linguistic classification, and that is a form of racism, because it is the nullification of the African American in particular, but the African in general. So allows still that carve out and that prejudice in all emerging incoming minority groups from Southeast Asia, etc., all get to pick up the white supremacy, and the white supremacists get to play the game of, well, you can't call they're not, you can't call them white supremacists. Of course you can. Anything that supports the supremacist structure, that's what it is. And
Yeah.
this is the old wine. The British call it divide and conquer. It's an old colonial tactic. And so when we talk about decolonization, we talk about tearing down that mindset. But since I'm dipping into the fact of our Creole heritage, brother, so a tree grows in the Bronx, brother. Tell me a little bit about your journey, and how did you end up in this space? How does a kid from the Bronx, man, the boogie down Bronx, end up becoming a very powerful and righteous leader in this space, if I may say so, even bragging on my family member? I'm just going to throw it out. Listen, everybody, they want to say, Aaron, what's your tribe? I says, there you go.
I appreciate that. So yeah, growing up in the Bronx, dad's from Haiti, mom's African American, dad's black from Haiti, mom's African American. Definitely experienced lots of racism growing up in school. Saw what we would call white ethnics kind of trying to sort out their white versus ethnicity stuff. That
Right.
was all interesting in real time. The thing that spurred me to action was actually tobacco, was cigarette use.
Really?
My family members smoked. I joined a group called NIPERG. They were doing stuff on a bunch of different issues, but tobacco was one. And as I started to unpeel that onion and find out, oh wait, the tobacco companies target black folks. In fact, many of all the advertisements that had black folks in it, tobacco and liquor were close to a majority of all the ads that had black
Hey,
folks.
listen, you couldn't get a Jet magazine or an Ebony magazine every
Right,
other day.
So it was like, oh wow, so PR firms can hire black folks and dark-skinned black folks too. They weren't even trying to pass for, no, they just all kind of black folks. Like,
the poisoning them.
that is a great ad. Look, these are the mix of black folks. Oh, but it's just for cigarettes. You can't do it for cars. Just for cigarettes. So, as I started to unpeel that onion, and various family members had cancer and lots of other stuff, I was really pissed. And so I started to get active on tobacco stuff. And once you started down that path, I saw a mix of different things. One, kind of the way that corporate racism, played differently on other goods that they were selling versus those ones that were really bad for the people who would take it. But then also how many black and brown institutions were funded by tobacco companies, and how then they weren't working on tobacco issues because they were funded by tobacco companies. And so then I ended up having friction with some black and Latino groups, both politicians and organizations.
Big sponsors of the NAACP.
Right. And I'd be like, well, why don't you work on it? They're like, well, because, our convention is funded by the it's like, okay, well, that's fucking. I'm working for a group that is far too white, but as a benefit of that, I can hold the tobacco companies accountable on behalf of Black people, whereas the Black groups can't. And then unpeel the onion one more. Well, why doesn't anybody else give you money? Why is it only the tobacco and liquor companies giving you money, right? So anyway, so that was all like very instructive, kind of by luck. So I ended up doing that work, lobbying in the city level, the state level. What helped to co-found the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. I was the first elected chair of that, and did just a mix of work there. Again, starting from the Bronx, went to school at City College, did a lot of work in Harlem, did work
Now,
around the Brooklyn.
which city college was that?
At City in Harlem,
Okay.
the City
Okay.
College, yeah. So I did a mix of a variety of the different people of color work, and then you and I had some interactions when I was in Albany, when you were fighting against the incinerator in Albany.
Oh, I'm going to say that for the toxic waste and race segment, but
gotcha,
you know.
gotcha. So yeah, so just going around the state and seeing so many of the places where there were people of color having a mix of different environmental attacks, and like the innovation being, it wasn't all the same. Everybody didn't have an incinerator, but they had something that was attacking them. And then lastly, as I traveled around the state, I realized that I would ask the taxi cab driver, was there a highway that went through the Black neighborhood here? And every single time the taxi cab driver was like, how did you know that? It is true. I had to move. So a little bit of why that guy was still a taxi cab driver was because the highway went through his neighborhood, totally messed up his family and community and educational opportunities. And so I ended up getting that kind of like almost a Derek Bellish education of randomly talking to cabbies who knew a hell of a lot more about the white supremacist structure of that region than some of the activists did, because they had actually lived and survived it and could crystallize it for me. So that's how I got to doing EJ work, to doing media justice work, campaign finances and racial justice work, and ended up later on doing voting rights, and now working with donors.
And really, if people want to read more about your organization, what's your website?
CaliforniaDonorTable.org.
Okay. And is there like a magic phone number, area code?
Best way is to check our website.
There you go.
Yeah.
You see what we did there, right? You see that?
Nice.
Boom,
nice.
boom. Just dropped it right there, brother. We try to rock that because there's no nation like donation, and brother, it don't run for free, and we gotta always, in asking your time, we also try to lift up the brand and build that support. But anyway, we got to get another commercial. Time flies when we're having fun. Let's get this commercial in. We'll be right back. Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Our guest, California Donor Table Executive Director, my cousin Ludovic Blain, who is a longtime actor. He's a little bit of our interview cycle at the back, because I do got like a little run of show. Again, beginning with his journey, his activist journey, and yes, he began with NYPIRG, and it was when he was working in the capital of the state of New York, in Albany, New York, that he and I crossed paths. And at that time, since 1988, I was actually battling as what was then the famous Answers incinerator. And in fact, what was really unique, as you remember about that project, I worked for the health department in the state of New York. So I actually committed career and class suicide because they poisoned my babies. And yes, I had to take on my boss, my boss's boss, and my boss's boss's boss, which was then Governor Mario Cuomo. And you remember, because of some of the actions that we had to engage in to build awareness around that struggle. And a lot of things were happening at that moment, because we had the Toxic Waste and Race come out in 1988. We had the first people of color Congress and Summit in Washington, D.C. The EJ movement was really becoming a movement. It went from this analysis that actually connected the dots. People go, well, we were the first, or we were the first. I go, no. I said, I'm an academic, and, you can have lots of incidents, what I call guerrilla warfare, uprisings, resistance, etc. But when these things all connect and everybody recognize they got a common enemy, and they realize that there's a common factor that binds them, and that there's an analysis that threads them together. And then when they come together and agree to act in a concerted effort, then you have a movement.
Right.
And so I'm always interested in about how a lot of leaders, again, who've done righteous work, not second guessing that, but the need to say who's the father of the movement, who's the mother of the movement. I'm always suspect of that, because I tell people, I says, well, one thing, the toxic waste and race study was the study that connected the dots. It was done by an Asian brother. This is why I'm proud that this was the People of Color Summit and Movement. The indigenous work by what would become IEN, the Indigenous Environmental Network, led by Tom Goldtooth. I mean, I remember before any of some of these local movements began that are now internationally famous. But that study is what pulled us together. And the person who coined it, the term environmental racism, Ben Chavis. I got to keep my Ben straight, because I got my brother Ben Jealous, I got Ben Chavis, But the point of the matter is, you know what I'm talking about, because it was the United Church of Christ right there in Harlem, right up there where our late brother Cecil Corbin Mark grew up. But that was where, up there Morningside Heights, where this work and this powerful study began. And so if you want to talk about the father of the movement, to me, that's a founding, that's where you actually had the individual who was the intellectual, who called for the analysis and the study and who convened the people. Charles Lee, Bernice Miller Travis, people, again, who would later on each become legends in the movement, and to me, I'm not want to take anything away from my brother Bob Bullock. I think he's more like the Benjamin Franklin of the movement, because Ben Franklin was an intellectual scholar and scribe, and he did powerful diplomatic work to bring in the international forces to support the revolution. To me, Bob, with his 30-odd books and countless articles and the work that he's done, has been that scribe of the movement. I will not take that away from him. But like I said, I always like to try to, as a pioneer, as a founder within that movement, to speak trust in our people. Well, Aaron, what's your title? I go, well, I'm the Alexander Hamilton of the movement. I'm a frontline revolutionary. I was on the front line, the battle line in Albany. And at that time, because I think West Harlem might have settled their lawsuit before us when David Dinkins became mayor and when REACT was founded. And then immediately after that, that's when we won and got our case up in Albany with the Answers Incinerator. And at that time, those were two of the largest settlements in the EJ movement in the country, and people don't realize, because most of the other battles, while famous, North Carolina, etc., they lost in court. They did not win. To this day, some of them are still fighting, some of those battles. And so this is why it's important when we get, brothers and sisters from that early movement struggle, and as I say, that were there, that have been around some of the leaders, because then it was in the 90s that you were one of the founders of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that journey and the setting up? This is another federalizing movement, taking a bunch of local EJ organizations throughout the 5 boroughs and trying to pull them together.
Right.
So tell us about that journey.
Sure. So I started to do the tobacco work, and there were lots of ads and stuff in Harlem, and working a bit with get the pastor's name, Calvin Butts, who was doing a lot of that tobacco work. And then stepping back, I started to hear it was starting to be described as an environmental justice issue. And then as we kind of evaluated, I was going to City College in Harlem, evaluated kind of what was happening in the neighborhood around the college, heard about WEACT, heard about the sewage treatment plant. I had already smelled the sewage treatment plant. I didn't know what it was, but you knew something was wrong. Like, where is that smoke coming from? That's not one person's toilet. I know that. So, and started talking with them, started working with them. And in NYPIRG, and I became the environmental justice staffer. We ended up working with a mix of the folks doing EJ work in communities of color in the South Bronx. We were the ones who told the local folks about a medical waste incinerator that was there. And then the folks in Harlem were already working on the sewage treatment plant. There were folks citywide working on lead poisoning. There was a proposed incinerator in Brooklyn, garbage incinerator, and then there was the world's largest landfill in Staten Island. And then many of those things were actually connected because if you, one of the pitch was, well, if we open this thing, we can close your thing. You know, or if we open this one and make this one bigger, we can close your one, right? So, and these were, now working in California, I have a better sense because I'm working in another big state. But, you know, New York City in most places would be a state. It is bigger than most states.
Yeah, 12 million
people. It and its suburbs are bigger than most states. So, so combining, like introducing and aligning folks from different neighborhoods who would really have no reason to go to the other neighborhood because it would be a few hours away.
And actually, more than neighborhood, different boroughs.
Different boroughs, right? Like this is 5 million away.
From Brooklyn. You're from Brooklyn. It's like, you know, like telling somebody I'm from England, you're from China, you're from France. You know, I mean,
right. So it's like, why would I go to Brooklyn? I'm not going there. And you know, I go there twice a year to visit family. Then I come back. You know, like we make the trek there, and then we, you know, we make the trek back. So so we started to connect those folks, and those folks started to connect with each other. And then various other things started to pop up. The mass transportation work, realizing, well, actually, you know, in New York City, both really everybody from.
Who was your partner in crime when y'all set up NEJA?
So it was Peggy Shepard, Vernice Miller, Michael Galopter, Luis. So Peggy Shepard and Vernice Miller from West Harlem. We Act. It was Nina LaBoy and several other folks from the Bronx group working against incinerator. It was Luis Garden Acosta and several other folks working against the Brooklyn Navy Yard incinerator. It was a mix of folks.
Okay, I'm thinking Yolanda Rivera and Nostradamus, right?
They came on a little bit later, but yeah. And then it was a mix of folks working on lead poisoning, some of the folks working on mass transit, and then some white folks in Staten Island who were against the landfill, and then different things started to pop up as we started to evaluate more things. Like I said, mass transit, with all the budget cuts and the fare hikes, we realized, well, this is in some ways an environmental justice issue, because I mean, if you can't get around, you can't go to work, or you know, it's a kind of basic right thing. People don't have cars. And then plus, the more expensive the trains would be, the more cars would drive from the suburbs through your neighborhood to their job. So even if you were not taking the train, you need the suburban people to take the train, because that pollutes your lungs less, because you're in between their house and their job. So that popped up. And then in the mid 90s, we realized that most of New York City schools were heated by coal, which was even to this day, it's like shocking. So the only places that were heated by coal in New York City were the public schools, and they didn't even have like really chimneys. So it was just the kids, like you just had, the coal was just burning on the kids. You know,
it's one of my proud projects is when we worked for that first bond act. One of the things that I was the whip on was the shutting down of the New York City schools, the coal-fired plants within the city schools. That a lot of folks, I tell people, you can say one thing about George Pataki. The bond act was the thing he did right, in getting rid of the thing that was triggering more asthma in the community, of burning coal in schools. I mean, I said, only New York City would give Joe Manchin a break. But listen, speaking of breaks, we got to get another commercial in here, and we're going to pick it right up at the last bit. Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Our guest, this final leg, my brother and cousin, Ludovic Blain. Again, you know, people say, well, you got to keep it professional. Well, yes, he's the director of the California Donors Table. You know, we got that, but that's when we talk about movements and leaders coming together, you know, there's always the genuine affection, because missing one another, talking about the movement where, you know, early parts of our lives, our organizing lives have crossed, watching the growth in one another, but still holding it down, brother, still holding it down. And that's and hitting strategic areas of need. You're hitting the finance space and making sure the movement is financed, and this is where real power is at. I'm dealing in wilderness carbon sinks from the carbon level because I'm one of the handful of African American experts in the country that deals with wilderness ecosystem and forest as the wilderness campaign director for the Adirondack Council. And people go, why are you up in the Adirondacks? I said, do you realize the first in 1826 to 1840s, the black suffrage settlements are actually in the high peaks of the Adirondacks? And that if you hear about Solomon Northup, 12 years a slave, do you know that he was born and raised in the Adirondack Mountains? Wow. That our history is rich and deep in resistance movement. John Brown came to live in the Adirondack Mountains to be up near what they call Timbuktu, which in 1846, there were only two places in the world called Timbuktu, one in West Africa and the other a resistance community for voting rights up in the Adirondacks. Wow. So I cannot be in any other place in space.
Right.
Leveraging and rocking that deep intellectual, but it's taking it back, right? It's reclaiming our time, because when people like to talk that the environment, this as if the environmental movement is a white space. No, it's a people space. We come from rural societies, rural agriculture. We were stripped away from wilderness and wild places. We lived in harmony with the land. And so for me, being in this place in space, coming that full circle within the arc and history of our family in the Caribbean and in this country, it is just a blessing. But to still, as our ancestors, to be, the current 21st century Nat Turner is still out in the field fostering justice, brother. I mean, it's just
never giving up our drapetomania, our passion for freedom and justice.
And that's so critical. And we were talking a little bit about the First People of Color Summit and how that really went from incidents and particulars and folks looking at their region, mainly in the South, etc., but really pulling people together from all over the country, from all over the United States. And like I said, what the powerful thing about that moment, tell people, I says, I remember when Tom Gold too, before there was an IN. And so when you have that clear memory, and they have it, Michael Galapa says, Michael Galapa did the first GIS analysis that I've seen in the environmental justice movement. When you just have that knowledge, people experimenting with technologies, just bringing them raw to the field, applying GIS to environmental equity. He was one of the first to do that. I don't think there was a white person, in the early 90s doing GIS and linking. I mean, after his work, Samara Swanston and other people, other folks who are doing spatial analytics. But, you got to give props to those who are blazing the new paths. And I know that a lot of people are writing books, but the stories like this, when you're a witness on the ground to see a new flower and watch everybody go, wow, you were there when that moment happened. And, it's lifting, up, those voices. You were talking about Nija and the moving from various boroughs, like I call the gangs of New York, everybody looking out for their turf, to actually now in a federalized entity called New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, meaning an alliance where you're now moving from fiefdoms to a collective. That was a very, very powerful. Now, did Majora Carter, did y'all hire her after, or when did Majora come on?
Much later. The first ED that we hired was Michelle DePass, actually.
Yes, Michelle. Yes.
Oh, yeah. And so she was the ED for environmental for Nija. I don't think she had done. Most people hadn't done. There weren't that many people who had done environmental justice work. So
right. Well, we're all figuring it out.
Right. We were all in the first part of the first generation of doing it. But she really helped to pull together those regions, those races and ethnicities, those collaborations, the different policy threads. There were many folks who were pitted against each other. And what Nija and NIPERG were able to do together was, there's still lots of VJ stuff to be tackled, but was to actually work to solve the incinerator and the garbage dump thing together. So
the solid waste issue.
The solid waste issue, at least the first chunk of it together, that we were able to keep the incinerator from getting built. And that pitch worked to organize that. There was lots of people of color in that, and that organized the Democrats in the assembly to want that bill. And then the white Republicans in Staten Island wanted to close their garbage dump, which was the city's.
Yep, the world's largest land. Well, actually, the U.S.'s largest landfill in the country, because you can see it from space.
Right, from space. And so, and the Senate was run by Republicans. And what had previously happened was different people, like you would get it through one committee first, it would never pass. The same thing couldn't pass both, because what people would say is, we're going to do either your thing or their thing. So through that kind of alliance building, both within communities of color and then between the communities of color and the mostly white folks in Staten Island, we were able to push a bill together to stop the Brooklyn Navy Yard incinerator and close down the Staten Island landfill together in the same bill.
And that's a piece of the movement that is lost. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And people don't realize how significant shutting down Fresh Kills was, and the stopping of the Brooklyn Navy Yard incinerator, because now this multi-billion-dollar real estate development. Isn't it funny how we clean stuff up and then folks come in, capitalists come in and make money?
Yes. So that's so I'd say that one, that was a huge win that wasn't really trumpeted. And frankly, while the people of color were willing to celebrate benefits to both the people of color in Brooklyn and elsewhere and the white folks in Staten Island, the folks in Staten Island didn't really want to celebrate the people of color part of the win. So that was challenging. But I will say that then later on, a few years later, I did communications work, including for some folks here in the Bay in San Francisco around an incinerator that they had in the Black neighborhood there. And I kind of threw them off because I said, look, you got to beat this incinerator. It was already on. You got to beat this incinerator. But let me tell you something. You better own your stuff first before you beat that. I'm it's killing you. I know what's coming out of this. Yes. However, if you beat that thing, you ain't going to be living here anymore. You're going to move to wherever there's another incinerator somewhere else. So I think your goal is to live somewhere with no incinerator rather than to not have an incinerator here and you assume you're going to be here permanently, because it was like on a sloping hill overlooking the whole bay. It was a beautiful place. And so they were actually thrown off. I probably didn't give enough context, but I was like, I was just in Brooklyn 5 years ago. We beat this incinerator. You know who doesn't live there anymore? Most of the people who fought against the incinerator. They don't live there anymore. They had to move because now after the incinerator house, a park and all these things, which those people before, they wanted a park there and everything. And there is a park there now, but they're not there. So there's two things the incinerator is not there and the people of color are not there, but the park is there.
Right.
So they won, but where they live, I'm pretty sure is somewhere else where there's something else happening. So yes, there are lessons to be learned through doing this work over decades. And you see how there is a string of white supremacy that goes throughout all this policymaking, of course, systemic racism. And even when you win on one part, you win on the beating the environmental pollution.
You get rid of the dirty, but now at the point when it becomes a green amenity, the other part of environmental racism, because people want to be now next to the green amenity.
Right.
So when we fight for waterfront cleanups, then all of a sudden the old black fishing hole, the old Hispanic fishing hole along the Hudson River, we get kicked off the beach.
Right.
Okay. Now there's a curfew, where back in the day, we fished until we came up in the morning, and it is that other part of the struggle of, having equitable sharing in the clean amenity. They don't mind, putting, NIMBY, not my backyards, and PIBBY, put it in brown people's backyards.
Right.
But the minute that it gets cleaned up, the positive amenity, all of a sudden, like Logan's Run, you can't, Richard Pryor said, you don't see any African Americans in the future.
Right. What happened?
And to me, that really is kind of the 21st century struggle, right? That W.E.B. Du Bois said, the struggle of our people and the survival of America is going to be this conversation over the color line, even when we're fighting for green spaces.
Yes.
But the point of what I like about what you're doing is that you are financing that revolution.
we're doing our best to make sure folks can fight at the scale they need to win. So it's not pity money. It's not dancing to our song or whatever. We're funding folks to figure out themselves and strongly encouraging them to collaborate across issues and constituencies so that when they win for all folks. And it's been an exciting ride, and I'm really appreciate ending up in this position.
Well, brother, I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be on the show and for us to capture this very important piece and story, but these other pieces of history, you know, and that we got them, you know, for, as they say, for the internet, for the world to see, and for scholars to find, but also to lift up and know these stories. Again, we want to thank you, brother, for taking time out of your schedule.
Thanks so much for having me.